Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today, our topic is going to be cyber coverage. We're going to take a nice close look at what kind of coverage we're offering and how you can talk about it with your customers. This webinar is going to go a lot better if you ask questions throughout. So there's a questions box on your screen. Please type your questions in as they come up, and I'll try to answer them as timely as possible. I'll leave some extra time at the end for any straggler questions, but I really do encourage you guys to ask the questions as we're talking about each topic, and then we can take deeper dives into what you guys want to know about. So thank you all for joining us. If I don't know you personally, my name is Ellie Feldman. I'm the Managing Director of Wingman, and we're here today to talk about cyber. So knowing the coverage is half the battle. That's one of the things that will really set you apart from your competition. I know how difficult it can be to go into a sales pitch and not feel completely comfortable with the material. And we want to set you guys up to all have the tools that you need to really explain the coverage and answer any questions that might come up. So again, if you're hearing questions already from customers or you want to anticipate what they're going to ask, throw your questions out as we go along. So what I'm going to use today to walk through this, which I think will be the most helpful for you guys, is I'm actually going to use the quote letter or the schedule on the deck page of the policy itself to really talk about what each coverage is, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, and we can then be able to talk to our customers better about how this all works. One housekeeping note as we get started, you'll notice there are two handouts. Those handouts are going to help you. One is the slides from this presentation. If you email me after, I can send them to you, or you can just download them right now. Also is a designed breakdown of the coverage, a Wingman sales one sheet that specifically outlines the coverages that you can then copy and send to your customers, include with your quote letter, etc. That really might help. So I hope you guys download those two things. And as always, if you have any needs for them after the presentation, you just let me know. All right, so what you're looking at right now is the first half of the quote letter. And what it really serves to emphasize is the two sections of coverage generally on the policy: the claims made or third-party coverage, and then the first-party coverages. This is just one page of it, and we'll get into considerably more detail as we continue on. This is the rest of the single page of the quote letter, all of the coverages that are included. We call these our coverages by endorsement, and they're going to really outline, highlight, and enhance all of the coverages that are on the first page. Okay, let's get started. Part one, section one of the quote letter. The first thing you see in the top left corner are the third-party coverages. This is what I politely refer to as old school cyber. So you have a data breach, you get sued for it, and you need to be covered for that lawsuit. That is what we politely refer to as enterprise security event coverage. Now, one of the reasons why cyber is so crazy complicated is that every insurance company, cyber liability company, cyber company, security company calls the same things 100 different names. So I'm going to use the Axis names today because that's the policy that you're going to be selling, but I'll try my best to sort of explain exactly how the coverage might look or appear to somebody else. So enterprise security event coverage is your basic coverage for the lawsuit itself. If you have a data theft, a denied access, a loss of data, a disclosure of data, and there is a class action lawsuit, this is what's going to cover you. Now, the second piece of this third-party coverage is the one that's most talked about, and that's privacy regulation coverage. So it's called a lot of things, but it's basically the coverage that is afforded to your customer should the regulatory bodies in a state, in a country, go after them for a data breach. So you're reading a lot about this now, in particular with regards to one entity, and that is the GDPR. The General Data Protection Requirements, or GDPR, is the European Union's very strict data laws. And the regulatory body of the European Union is going after insureds for violating the rules and regulations. This coverage, this privacy regulation coverage, is going to give them payback for the fines, the penalties, and the claims expenses for the actual suit brought by the regulatory bodies. And that can be the federal government, the state of California, or the European Union, along with anywhere else. This is a pretty broad coverage, some of the best in the industry. And this is a growing concern when it comes to cyber. All right. Now we go into section 2, which is the first party coverages. So these are the things that make the headlines for the most part, and these are the things that might be more familiar to your customer or feel as though it's something that they are more comfortable talking about. So the first one is what you guys will know as breach notification expenses. It's the coverage that is oftentimes afforded in a bolt-on to a bot policy. It is specifically the costs of notifying customers if there's been a data breach. So this is the coverage for the cost of notifying any people, including those you are not legally obligated to notify, to inform them that their personally identifiable and protected data may have been lost, stolen, or accessed. Now, what this really means is, and this is where Axis really is stronger than so many other carriers, is the state of California and many other states, New York, Virginia, require you to notify and disclose if you have a certain number of customers whose data have been breached. This is going to cover that cost. It's also going to cover for the states that don't legally require you to notify. You should notify anyway because it's the right thing to do. It's also going to cover really important other things like the call center, the website, and other things that we'll talk about more as we go through this process. But it's a very broad coverage. And the reason why this one's important and the fact that it's full policy limit coverage is that unlike so many of these bolt-on policies, you need that full policy limit because each individual person that you have to notify can cost upwards of $200. So a $20,000 sublimit or a $50,000 sublimit is really not going to scratch the surface should you actually have a data breach. Next up is the fraud response coverage. Now, ironically enough, they break this into two sections, the notification and the fraud response. This is credit monitoring and identity theft monitoring if social security numbers, credit card numbers, or bank account numbers are breached. This is an additional expense. And so it has a completely separate claim limit. Next up are the public relations expenses. So this pays for the costs associated with hiring the PR firm, any crisis management firm, any advertisements, any website costs, legal crisis management costs, or other communications relating to the response to a breach. These things can really add up, and having a full policy limit per claim for this is very important. Guys, if you have any questions or you want me to elaborate on anything in particular, just let me know. Forensics and legal is pretty straightforward. You have to hire those computer people. You have to hire the lawyers if you suspect that there's a breach and you need to investigate whether there has been. These people are expensive, $50,000, $100,000 a pop oftentimes, and having this coverage is important. And finally, in this top section, you'll see extortion loss. We're going to talk more about this in a later section, the ransomware section. So I'm going to just hold off on that, but suffice it to say, this is an important coverage and we're going to dive deeper into that. Okay, section 3 is business interruption. And this gets its own separate section because it actually encompasses 3 separate coverages. So this is another one of those cyber coverages that is complicated unnecessarily by the lack of standard terminology. So I'm going to explain to you what each one means using the Axis terms, but if you have any questions, you let me know. System disruption. is when the system that your insured owns or operates goes down and the company is unable to work. Now, contrast that with service disruption, which is if a company that is one of your vendors goes down and you are unable to work, then you can receive business interruption coverage. So let's try these with a different vernacular. How about first-party business interruption for system disruption and contingent business interruption for service disruption? So this is why people get confused, and I completely understand. But basically, the most important thing to take away from this is it doesn't matter because they're both covered. So they both have a 6-hour waiting period. I'm sorry, 6-hour waiting period. And that means that it's like a retention of sorts for the business interruption coverage. And the final here is data recovery expenses. And this makes a lot of sense. If your system or service goes down and you lose a chunk of data, this is going to pay for the costs associated with recovering any data that's lost or stolen, damaged or destroyed, or otherwise corrupted. So business interruption is a huge claims driver. I talk about this constantly. And I'll try to use an example that you'll understand. Most of you guys contract with a particular insurance company to handle your billing and accounting. If you were unable to receive money for a period of several days, how much revenue would your entity lose? Would you lose customers? How would that look? That's your service disruption charge. Now, many of you are now setting up your own systems. Maybe you're building them yourselves. Maybe you rely on your website to feed you business. If your website goes down for a period of several days and you don't get any business in, how much revenue would you lose? Maybe it's for an extended period of time. That's your system disruption coverage. So this is a very important coverage to explain to customers and to parse out really for your insureds, do they have these risks? How can you explain it to them? How can you make them understand how important this can be? Oftentimes resolving major system or service disruptions can be in excess of a week. And how much revenue, how much market share would you lose if you couldn't use your computers? Section 4 is PCI fines. So I want to highlight this one for a number of reasons. You'll remember from the application process that one of the few underwriting questions we ask is if a customer accepts credit cards, are they or their vendor what we call PCI compliant? So PCI compliance is a complicated way of explaining a very simple concept. There is a federal law called the PCI DSS law, and it outlines a baseline regulatory standard for monitoring, keeping, using, and maintaining credit card numbers. And any company that processes credit cards must adhere to a certain minimum standards. And furthermore, they must be certified by a regulatory body that they actually maintain these standards. And so any company that you contract with to do your credit cards, they are going to have gone through this PCI compliance process. It's pretty standard now. I would say 99% of vendors are PCI compliant. And I'll tell you that if you're using a vendor who's not PCI compliant, you should fire them immediately. And we're not going to insure anybody who's not, because at this point, everybody should be. So why do you get separate coverage for this? Well, because they've made it so incredibly easy for people to follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, it's going to cost you with massive, massive fines. And so this is why we ask about the PCI compliance on the application, and it's why the coverage is afforded, because if, God forbid, something went wrong and you don't maintain PCI compliance, you will get hit with massive fines. Furthermore, there's an additional coverage by endorsement for the recertification process. So that means if you're a company that was PCI compliant, but then wasn't following the rules and you get hit with these fines, you have to go back through the process of compliance, and there is coverage for that process as well. Okay, section 5, and we're just going to run through this whole thing, this whole left strip one at a time. And the top one is website media liability coverage. So this is an interesting trend in the cyber world where anything web-based goes on a cyber policy, even if it really has nothing to do with cybersecurity. And one of the benefits to your customers of this trend is being able to get a certain amount of media liability coverage without purchasing an E&O policy or a media liability policy. Now, it's not going to be full-blown media coverage. What is it going to cover? It's going to only cover online activities. So nothing print. Print, an example would be, let's say one of your customers is a beverage manufacturer and they put information on their labels that says, it's, the best drink in the world according to such and such, and that's not true. And they get sued. If it's on the labels, it's not going to be covered. If they put that on their website, it actually is. So it's going to cover the copyright, the libel, and the slander. And this is substantive for a lot of reasons. It's going to be excluded from most other policies. It keeps the cost down so many of your smaller companies don't have to buy a full-blown media policy. And it affords them a good amount of protection for a legitimate risk if they have an online presence. So everything from forums and anything else it's going to cover, and that's substantive. So for your online presence, this is a really nice sales hook to use with customers. Section 6, ransomware. So here's where we're going to talk about two of my favorite coverages together, ransomware and extortion. Now, the ransomware gets its own line here, but in reality, the endorsement itself is actually adjusting the extortion coverage to include both ransomware and extortion. Now, why, if they're two different things, would you put them together? Here's why. Let me give you an example. Most ransomware and extortion starts the same way. A piece of malware, bad computer code, gets into your computer system and it locks your system down. It does not give you access to it. Now, in the case of extortion, the person who is extorting you is going to say, I will release all of your data publicly unless you pay me X amount of money. Ransomware, on the other hand, is the exact opposite with the same startup. So it's still the malware, your system gets locked down, but instead of threatening to make your data public, they say, we won't even let you use your system again until you pay us. So you are locked out of your own computers until you pay us a certain amount of money in a certain span of time. So oftentimes these two coverages are lumped together. Now, it's important to note because some of the older cyber policies will cover extortion, but they will not cover ransomware. And that's terrible because more often than not, this is going to be seen as ransomware and not as extortion. Ransomware, or the locking you out of your own computer system, is one of the most prevalent forms of cybercrime today. And having a full limit coverage for it is very important for your customers. Claims can be anywhere from the payout, which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, to the restoring your system from a backup, or worse, losing all of your information, cleaning up your systems, getting the malware off your systems. If they had access to any data while they were in your computer systems, there might be a breach notification component as well. So ransomware is really dirty and can be incredibly costly. Okay, section 7, which is social engineering. This is something that's talked about often and understood little, and it is very important to discuss with customers because it is almost entirely what I politely refer to as user error. Imagine a scenario where your head of accounting or operations gets an email from your CEO or you personally saying, here's the invoice for such and such a company, pay them, here's the wire instructions. And your accountant or whomever goes in, sees it looks legitimately like it's from you, and they pay the bill and off it goes. So there's two components to what I just explained. A good faith requirement by the person who pays that bill, and an actual request for money, that, as it turns out, is not real. So what ends up happening, and the most common type, is what's called email spoofing. And that's where your CEO, it looks like they are emailing you, but in reality, they're not. And so you're paying a bill in good faith to somebody, but it's complete fraud. Wouldn't you like to get that money back? Because you can't get it back any other way. Social engineering coverage was born with the idea that technically a digital means was used to transfer money. It's a crime loss in reality, but because there was a good faith effort and not an actual crime by your employee, they have put it on the cyber coverage. Now, oftentimes digital stuff like this and the good faith things are excluded from a bot policy. So unless they have a full-blown crime policy, they're probably not covered for this without cyber. It is sub-limited to 250,000. That's going to cover pretty much any real social engineering claim. And I'd like you to think about it this way. If you had a bill for more than $250,000, you would check, or we would hope that you would check to make sure it's going to the right place. Now, there are some times, and I've heard of many, where that's not the case, but we're covering up to the first 250,000. Questions, guys? Okay. Next up is my favorite useless coverage. I am kind of mean to telecom fraud coverage, but I genuinely don't really understand its value. And watch, we'll have a claim next week. I've actually never seen a claim in this particular coverage, but the idea is this: you have a phone, a fax, or whatever system, and third parties are illegally using it, and those charges are charged to you. Now, I think this was done in a time when there was like long distance calling charges, et cetera. I'm guessing in the modern era, this is going to appear more as someone is able to use your system to make robocalls, and you get charged or potentially fined for that. This is going to cover the service charges and any fees that are charged to you by the fraudulent use of your telecommunications systems. Next up, we just got a question in, not just the fax line. No, it's for phones or faxes. You're good for both coverages on that part. As far as telecom fraud goes. Sorry, I'm seeing a bunch of questions coming in. I'm just going to pop them out so I can see them properly. Okay. Okay. What have we got here? What about someone using Wi-Fi? So you don't technically own or really use your Wi-Fi system. If there are charges coming in because of your Wi-Fi, it would not be covered. This is really more for your telecommunications software. Your telecommunications charges. Ed, I've got your question coming in towards the end, so I'm just going to hold off on that one. Okay, let me go back one. Reputational harm coverage. This is a new coverage for us, and I'm kind of excited about it because it really shows the future and where cyber coverage is going. So number one thing to note on this is it's a full policy limit coverage, which is rare. We're ahead of the curve on that one. But what it does is essentially extend business interruption for when your system isn't down, but your company loses value. So imagine you've had a massive data breach and you've been notifying people and you lose customers, you lose revenue because of it. It's in the news, you're getting slammed, whatever. Your lost income from the cyber breach incident is going to be covered even if your system doesn't go down. So that's what reputational harm does. If they say if you're able to quantify that you lost business because your reputation got hit from a cyber breach, you're going to be covered. Okay, so keep your questions coming in. It's questions time, and I'm going to start with Ed's question that he sent ahead of time. All right, would business email compromise be considered social engineering? So I thought about this a lot, Ed, and really I think it falls into two categories. Email fraud, which would be similar to what I explained as the email spoofing, if it is used to steal money, yes, that's social engineering, classic case. Another time where business email compromise, or the term business email compromise, can apply is, imagine you guys are all now getting your own email addresses and setting up your own business systems. Imagine if Microsoft 365 went down and you had no access to your emails, your documents, your whatever. That's contingent business interruption, or the service disruption coverage that we talked about on the business interruption front. So you can really look at it in two ways. But the important thing is that yes, both of them are covered. Okay, so great question. On the service system disruption, once the 6-hour waiting period is over, does the coverage go retroactive to cover those 6 hours? No, it starts at the 6-hour mark. Questions? Send them in. Okay, for the reputational coverage, McDonald's has a breach across the country, and the location you insured has a reputational hit. That's an interesting example. So I think in that particular case, it would sort of depend. In all likelihood, the coverage would apply to McDonald's corporate, not necessarily your customer, but potentially. This is really for a first-party data breach scenario. So if the data breach occurred at your particular customer location, then I would say yes, the reputational coverage would 100% kick in, but not if it was not their systems. What about business interruption coverage for a vendor that one of your vendors uses? Oof. There has to be a contractual relationship between the insured and the vendor. So no, that would not be covered. You could stretch for it, but in reality, it sort of depends on where the onus falls. My guess is if it's a down at your vendor's vendor, if it causes your vendor to go down, then maybe. So the example you have is we had a loss where your AMS provider was affected by a cloud storage provider that they used. Yeah, so if AMS went down because of their cloud storage provider and that affects you, your contractual relationship with AMS would do it. That being said, the insurance company that would end up paying out on that would actually be the cloud service provider, but it's certainly worth, and the most important thing is if these things happen, call the claims hotline and the lawyers, because they'll be able to tell you right off exactly what you're working with and how the best way to go about fixing it. All right, great question just came in. The deductible is one aggregate deductible. That's right. There is one aggregate policy limit and one aggregate deductible. If you have multiple instances and you pay the deductible on the first instance, you don't have to pay it again. That's a really good thing to point out. Yeah, there was a typo. I'm pretty sure it's 6 hours for the waiting period. I noticed that my handout says 8 hours. I'm pretty sure it's 6 hours, but I'll double check and send everybody an email since I did notice that as well. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes, I'm getting a ping from somebody in my office that's saying yes, it is 6. It is 6 hours. I think the quote letter I pulled was actually just had a typo on it. Rogue employee coverage. So this has come up a couple of times, and it's one of those weird situations where we're not offering full crime coverage. If a rogue employee steals from you, there's not much a cyber policy can do it, even if they do that online. If a rogue employee releases your data, that's sort of a different situation. So it really all depends on the situation itself and what happens. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but if it really is a crime, then it's not going to be covered. If it really is a cyber breach, then it will be. It's the best way I can describe it. So the concern being that the rogue employee steals data. So yeah, I mean, just as you owe a duty to your employees to keep their data safe as you would a customer, vice versa. If you have ownership over that data and it gets out, um, yeah, I mean, it depends on how they steal it. So I can get you more information on that if you want, if you have a specific example. Um, but the best I would say is the rogue employee would obviously not be covered, but the organization would be. Anything else? Keep your questions coming. They're good ones. Okay, well, we're exactly at 30 minutes, which is always what I try to do. Should you have any follow-up questions or any concerns, you let me know. Please download the handouts that are attached to this webinar. And thank you all for coming and joining us. We hope to see you next time, where we're going to do a deep dive into the system, our computer systems themselves, so that you and all of your employees and colleagues can ask any questions on how to do things in our system, get a full-scale demo, as it were. So we hope to see you then. It's in a couple of weeks. I'll be sending out an email with the invite shortly. Thank you all for joining me.